The kitchen clock read 5:17 a.m. when Margaret Hayes cracked the first egg into the mixing bowl. Outside, Riverside Drive was still dark, the streetlights casting long shadows across her front yard. She'd been awake since 4, unable to sleep with the anticipation churning in her stomach like it had every year on this day for the past 42 years. Today was Jessica's birthday. Margaret reached for the cocoa powder, measuring it carefully into the bowl. Red velvet cake, Jessica's favorite since she was 6 years old, when they'd shared a slice at the bakery downtown after her first dance recital. Margaret could still see her daughter's face, chocolate red frosting smeared across her chin, eyes bright with joy. "Mommy, this is the best cake in the whole world," Jessica had said, swinging her legs under the table. Margaret had kissed her forehead. "Then we'll make it your birthday tradition, sweetheart." And she had, every single year for 36 years. Even the year she'd worked a double shift at the hospital and hadn't slept for 26 hours. Even the year arthritis had made her fingers so stiff she could barely hold the whisk. Love, Margaret had always believed, was measured in consistency, in showing up year after year with the same damn cake. She folded the batter gently, watching the deep red color swirl and blend. The morning light was just beginning to creep through the window, catching the dust motes in the air. This house had seen so much. She and David had bought it 38 years ago, when Jessica was only 4. Back then, the mortgage had seemed impossible, but David had squeezed her hand and said, "We'll make it work, Maggie. Our daughter deserves a yard to play in." Margaret's eyes drifted to the photograph on the refrigerator. David in his police uniform, grinning at the camera, his arm around a teenage Jessica. The photo had been taken 3 weeks before the accident. 3 weeks before a drunk driver had run a red light on Highway 9 and turned Margaret's world inside out. She'd been 38 years old. Jessica had been 8. And just like that, Margaret had become both mother and father, working double shifts as a nurse while cleaning office buildings at night to keep this house, to keep Jessica in her dance classes, to make sure her daughter never felt the crushing weight of poverty that Margaret had known as a child. "You did good, David," she whispered to the photograph. "She graduated college. She has a career, a family. We did it." But even as she said the words, something cold settled in her chest. When was the last time Jessica had looked at her with warmth? Really looked at her, not threw her like she was furniture, an inconvenience to work around? Margaret shook her head, dismissing the thought. She was being silly, ungrateful even. Jessica was busy, a marketing director at a tech firm, managing a team of 15 people. She had Connor and Emma to raise, a household to run. Of course, she didn't have time for long conversations over coffee like they used to. The oven timer beeped. Margaret slid the cake pans in, then moved to the dining room to begin decorating. She'd bought white roses this time, Jessica's current favorite, though she'd loved daisies as a child. People change, Margaret reminded herself. That's natural. She arranged them in the crystal vase, the one that had been a wedding gift from David's mother. By 9 a.m., the house smelled like cocoa and vanilla. Margaret had frosted the cake, arranged the roses, and set the table with her good china. She'd even ironed the tablecloth, pressing out every wrinkle with the care of someone who believed details mattered. She stood back, surveying her work. The dining room looked beautiful. Sunlight streamed through the windows, making the crystal vase sparkle. Everything was perfect, except Margaret walked slowly through her own house, seeing it as if for the first time in years. The walls were no longer the warm cream color she and David had chosen. They were gray now. Greyga, Jessica had called it, a modern neutral. Jessica had hired painters 2 years ago without asking, saying the house needed updating. The floral curtains Margaret had sewn herself, the ones with the tiny violets that reminded her of her grandmother's garden, were gone, replaced with stark white blinds. Her armchair, the overstuffed blue one where she'd nursed Jessica as a baby, where she'd read bedtime stories, where she'd cried after David's funeral, had vanished. She'd found it later, shoved in the garage beneath old boxes. Even the photographs on the walls had changed. The gallery of Margaret's life, her and David's wedding, Jessica's baby pictures, vacations to the lake, had been replaced with modern art prints, black and white geometric shapes that meant nothing to anyone. When had this happened? How had she let her own home become unrecognizable? Margaret knew the answer. It had happened slowly, over the 3 years since Jessica had asked to stay temporarily while they renovated their house. Except the renovation never happened. and the temporary stay became permanent. Jessica and Bradley had taken over the master bedroom, Margaret's bedroom, the one she'd shared with David. "Just until we get back on our feet, Mom," Jessica had said. "The guest room is plenty for you." The guest room, 10 by 12 feet, barely large enough for a twin bed and a dresser. Margaret had moved her things in boxes, telling herself it was temporary, telling herself she was helping her daughter. That had been 3 years ago. The doorbell rang at 11:30, startling Margaret from her thoughts. She smoothed her blouse, the nice blue one she'd been saving, and hurried to the door. Her heart lifted as she pulled it open. "Happy birthday, sweetheart." Jessica stood on the porch, her face carefully neutral. She was beautiful, Margaret thought. 42 and still stunning, with David's dark eyes and strong jawline. Behind her, Bradley stood with his hands in his pockets, looking uncomfortable. Connor and Emma were already on their phones, not looking up. "Mom." Jessica's voice was flat. "What is all this?" Margaret's smile faltered. "I made your favorite cake. I thought we could have lunch together, like we used to. Remember when you were little, Mom, we need to talk." Jessica walked past her into the house, Bradley and the kids following. Margaret closed the door, her hands suddenly cold despite the warm day. Something in Jessica's tone made her stomach clench. They gathered in the dining room. Jessica stood at the head of the table, Margaret's seat, the one she'd sat in for 38 years, and folded her arms. "Sit down, Mom." Margaret sat. Connor and Emma had already collapsed onto the sofa in the living room, visible through the archway, their faces glowing blue from their phones. Bradley stood near the window, looking anywhere but at Margaret. Jessica pulled a glossy brochure from her purse and placed it on the table in front of Margaret. "Sunny Meadows Assisted Living?" Margaret stared at the brochure. On the cover, elderly people sat in a bright common room, smiling too widely. "A community of care for your loved ones." "I don't understand," Margaret said slowly. "We've found a place for you." Jessica's voice was matter of fact, like she was discussing a business transaction. "It's very nice. They have activities, people your age, professional medical staff." The room tilted. Margaret gripped the edge of the table. You're putting me in a home?" "We're getting you the care you need," Jessica corrected. "You're getting forgetful, Mom. Last week you left the stove on. What if there'd been a fire? You could have burned the whole house down." "I didn't," Margaret's voice came out as a whisper. "I didn't leave the stove on. That was Bradley. He made grilled cheese for the kids and forgot to turn it off. I turned it off." Jessica's expression didn't change. "You're misremembering. This is exactly what I'm talking about." "Jessica, please." Bradley's voice was quiet. "Maybe we should discuss this privately." Jessica turned on him sharply. "No, she needs to hear this. I've already paid the deposit. They have a room available next month." Next month. 4 weeks. Margaret's mind spun, unable to grasp what was happening. "The best gift you can give me, Mom, is to stop being a burden and let professionals take care of you." The words landed like physical blows. Burden, professionals, care. Margaret looked at her daughter, this woman she'd carried in her body, nursed at her breast, raised alone after David died. The little girl who'd cried in her arms after bad dreams. The teenager who'd needed her when her first boyfriend broke her heart. The young woman who'd called her crying when she found out she was pregnant with Connor, terrified and needing her mother. That daughter had disappeared. In her place stood a stranger with cold eyes. "Is this about the house?" The words came out before Margaret could stop them. Jessica's jaw tightened. "This is about what's best for everyone." "Everyone?" Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest. "Or just you?" "Don't be dramatic, Mom. You're 64 years old. You can't keep living alone in this big house. It's not safe." "I've lived in this house for 38 years. "Exactly. It's time to move on." Margaret looked at Bradley, silently pleading for help. He shifted his weight, opened his mouth, then closed it again. No help coming from that quarter. Connor glanced up from his phone for the first time, his eyes meeting Margaret's for a brief second before he looked away. Was that shame on his face, or just indifference? "I made your favorite cake," Margaret said, knowing how pathetic it sounded even as the words left her mouth. "It's your birthday." Jessica didn't even glance at the cake. "We can't stay. We have plans." "But I thought—" "You thought wrong." Jessica picked up her purse. "I'll send you the information about Sunny Meadows. The move-in date is June 15th. Start packing. She walked toward the door. Bradley followed, pausing for just a moment. I'm sorry, he mouthed to Margaret. Sorry, as if the word meant anything, as if he wasn't complicit in this, spineless in his silence. Emma and Connor shuffled past without a word, and then they were gone. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Margaret sat at the table, staring at the red velvet cake. 42 candles she'd planned to put on it, one for each year. She'd imagined Jessica's face lighting up, imagined her saying, "Oh, Mom, you remembered." She'd imagined wrong. The afternoon light moved across the table, turning the white roses pink, then gold. Margaret didn't move. She couldn't. If she moved, if she acknowledged what had just happened, it would become real. Finally, as the sun began to set, she stood on shaking legs and walked to her bedroom. Not the master bedroom. That belonged to Jessica now. The tiny guest room with its twin bed and single dresser. She opened the closet. Her clothes, fewer now than they used to be, hung neatly. Jessica had helped her declutter last year, donating most of Margaret's wardrobe to Goodwill. You don't need all this, Mom. You never go anywhere. On the top shelf, beneath a box of old tax returns, Margaret found it. The metal lockbox David had kept in his desk. She pulled it down, her hands trembling as she worked the combination. David's badge number, 2847. Inside were documents. The house deed, in Margaret's name. David's life insurance papers, paid out 26 years ago, every cent of which had gone to Jessica's college fund. Bank statements, birth certificates, and underneath it all, a letter in David's handwriting. Her breath caught. She'd forgotten about this letter, written in the hospital after his accident, in the 3 hours before he'd slipped into the coma from which he'd never woken. The envelope was yellowed with age, her name written across the front in his familiar scrawl. Her fingers shook as she opened it. My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm so sorry to leave you and Jessie alone. I'm so sorry you have to carry this weight without me. But please, my love, promise me something. Don't lose yourself in being a mother. You are Margaret first, the woman who wanted to paint, who dreamed of seeing the northern lights, who played violin so beautifully it made me cry. Jessica will grow up. She'll live her own life. And when that day comes, I need you to live yours. Not for me, not for her, for you. Protect our home. It's not just a house. It's your security, your independence. Promise me you'll never let anyone take that from you. The world needs your light, Maggie. Don't let anyone dim it. Forever yours, David. The tears came then, hot and harsh. Margaret pressed the letter to her chest and wept for the first time since David's funeral. She wept for the woman she'd been, the dreams she'd deferred, the life she'd put on hold. She wept for the daughter she'd raised, who had somehow become a stranger. And she wept for herself, for the 64-year-old woman sitting alone in a room the size of a closet, in the house she'd bought with her husband's life insurance money, being told she was a burden. When the tears finally stopped, something else remained. Something cold and sharp and clear. Margaret placed the letter carefully back in the box. Then she went to the kitchen and retrieved a notebook from the drawer, one of the cheap spiral-bound ones she used for grocery lists. She sat at the small desk in her room and began to write. Things Jessica has taken. 1. The master bedroom. 2. Control of the thermostat. I'm always cold now. 3. The garage. Can't park my car anymore. It sits in the driveway. 4. My armchair. 5. The photo albums, where are they? 6. My Saturday mornings. Jessica needs me to watch Connor and Emma. 7. My savings account password. When did that happen? Margaret's pen paused. Her savings account. When had Jessica asked for that password? She opened her laptop. The old one Jessica had said was too slow, and replaced with a tablet Margaret didn't know how to use properly. It took 3 tries to remember her banking password. She'd written it down somewhere, but where? Finally, she got in. Her checking account looked normal. Social Security deposit, automatic utility payments, small withdrawals for groceries. But her savings account made her blood run cold. She'd had $47,000 in that account. The remainder of David's life insurance, carefully saved over decades. Money for emergencies, for repairs, for her own future care if she ever needed it. The balance showed $8,342. Margaret clicked through the transaction history with shaking hands. $5,000 withdrawal, March 15th. Memo, car repair. $10,000 withdrawal, April 2nd. Memo, school tuition. $7,500 withdrawal, April 28th. Memo, home improvement. $12,000 withdrawal, May 10th. Memo, investment opportunity, on and on. Withdrawals every few weeks for the past year. Nearly $40,000, gone. Margaret's chest felt tight. She couldn't breathe. When had she authorized these? She didn't remember. No, she stopped that thought. She knew exactly what had happened. She hadn't authorized anything. Jessica had. Margaret navigated to her documents folder, looking for the power of attorney forms. She'd never signed one. She was certain of that. She was 64, not 94. She was perfectly capable of managing her own affairs. But there it was. A PDF titled POA_Hayes_Margaret.pdf. She opened it. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely control the mouse. It was a power of attorney document granting Jessica Hayes Thompson full control over Margaret Hayes' financial affairs. Signed and notarized 6 months ago. Margaret stared at the signature at the bottom. Margaret Hayes. It looked like her signature. Almost. But the M was wrong. She always looped it twice, a habit from her school days. This M was looped only once. It wasn't her signature. Jessica had forged it. Margaret's vision blurred. She closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of her small room, listening to the house settle around her. Somewhere upstairs she could hear water running, Bradley taking a shower. She could hear the TV from Connor's room, the bass thumping through the walls. She was surrounded by people, living in a house full of activity and noise, and she had never felt more alone. But beneath the loneliness, beneath the betrayal and hurt, something else was growing. Something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Anger, not the hot, explosive kind, the cold, calculated kind. The kind that David used to say was dangerous because it meant someone had finally decided to stop accepting things as they were. Margaret opened the notebook again and began a new list. What I need to do. 1. Find a lawyer. 2. Check the house deed. 3. Change all my passwords. 4. Get copies of all financial documents. 5. Find out what else Jessica has done. She paused, pen hovering over the paper. Then she wrote one more line. 6. Remember who I was before I became invisible. That night, Margaret lay in her narrow twin bed, staring at the ceiling. She could hear Jessica and Bradley talking in the master bedroom above her. Their voices were muffled, but she caught fragments. Too dramatic. She'll get over it. The house will sell for at least $600,000. Margaret's eyes flew open. Sell the house? She listened harder, her heart pounding. Once she's in Sunny Meadows, we can list it immediately. Jessica's voice, clear now. The real estate agent said this neighborhood is hot. Are you sure about this? Bradley's voice, uncertain. It feels wrong, Jess. What's wrong is letting an old woman live alone in a 4-bedroom house she can't maintain. We're doing her a favor. It's her house. It'll be ours soon enough. She can't take it with her. Margaret pressed her fist against her mouth to keep from crying out. This wasn't about care. This wasn't about safety or professional help or any of the reasons Jessica had given. This was about money, about inheritance, about Jessica deciding she was tired of waiting for her mother to die to get what she believed she was owed. Margaret got out of bed and walked to the window. The street was quiet, houses dark except for the occasional porch light. How many of her neighbors knew what was happening in this house? Did anyone see her slowly disappearing? She thought about Dorothy Reeves, 2 doors down. Dorothy was 78, widowed like Margaret. They used to have coffee together on Saturday mornings, before Jessica had declared that Saturday was family time, and Margaret needed to watch the kids. When was the last time she'd seen Dorothy? Weeks? Months? Margaret had become so small, so invisible that she'd disappeared even from her own friendships. But standing there in the darkness, looking out at the sleeping street, Margaret Hayes made a decision. She would not go to Sunny Meadows. She would not sign over her house. She would not disappear quietly to make her daughter's life more convenient. David had asked her to protect their home, to never let anyone take it from her. She'd failed him for 3 years. She'd let Jessica take over, piece by piece, until Margaret was nothing but a ghost haunting the edges of her own life. But she wasn't dead yet. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't incompetent. She was Margaret Hayes. She had survived her husband's death. She had raised a daughter alone. She had worked 2 jobs for years without complaint. She had built a life from nothing. And she would not let that daughter steal it from her. Tomorrow, she would find a lawyer. Tomorrow, she would start fighting back. But tonight she allowed herself one small act of rebellion. Margaret went downstairs to the kitchen. The red velvet cake sat on the counter, untouched. She cut herself a large slice, poured a glass of milk, and ate it slowly at the kitchen table. It was delicious, rich and moist, the cream cheese frosting perfectly sweet. And she decided something else. This would be the last red velvet cake she ever made. If she was going to bake from now on, it would be what she wanted. Lemon cake, David's favorite. Her favorite too, though she'd somehow forgotten that over the years. When she finished eating, Margaret washed her dish, dried it, and put it away. She turned off all the lights except the small one over the stove, and she went back to her tiny room and slept more soundly than she had in 3 years. Because for the first time in a very long time, Margaret Hayes had a purpose. She was going to get her life back. Margaret woke at 5 a.m., not from habit this time, but from purpose. She dressed quietly in the darkness of her small room, pulling on comfortable jeans and a sweater. Through the thin walls, she could hear Bradley's soft snoring from the master bedroom above. She had 3 hours before Jessica woke up. 3 hours before the household stirred to life. 3 hours to begin taking back what was hers. Moving as quietly as possible, Margaret gathered what she needed. Her purse, David's lockbox, her identification, and the notebook where she'd written everything down. She slipped out the front door at 5:47 a.m., closing it with barely a sound. The morning air was cool and fresh. Margaret stood on her own porch. When had she started thinking of it as her own porch, as if it might belong to someone else? And breathed deeply. The street was still dark, the sky just beginning to lighten at the edges. She didn't have her car. Jessica had taken her keys 3 months ago after Margaret had forgotten where she'd parked at the grocery store. Margaret hadn't forgotten. She'd parked in her usual spot, but Jessica had insisted, and Margaret, as always, had surrendered without a fight. Not anymore. Margaret began walking. The law office she'd found online was 2.3 miles away. She'd checked the route last night, memorized it. At 64, with arthritis in her knees, it would take her about 45 minutes. She started walking. The neighborhood transformed around her as the sun rose. Porch lights clicked off. Sprinklers sputtered to life. A jogger passed her, earbuds in, not making eye contact. Margaret used to jog, she remembered. Before Jessica had said it was dangerous for someone your age, and Margaret had believed her. By the time she reached Brennan and Associates, her knees ached and she was breathing hard, but she felt more awake than she had in years. The office was in a converted Victorian house, painted a cheerful yellow. A sign on the door read, "Walk-ins welcome, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m." It was 7:42. Margaret sat on the bench outside and waited. At exactly 8 o'clock, a woman in her late 40s arrived, juggling a coffee cup and a briefcase. She had gray-streaked auburn hair pulled into a messy bun and wore a navy pantsuit that had seen better days. "You're early," the woman said, not unkindly. "I like that." She unlocked the door and held it open. "I'm Sarah Brennan. Come on in." Margaret followed her inside. The office was cluttered but clean, with case files stacked on every surface and framed certificates on the walls. Sarah Brennan, J.D. University of Michigan Law, Elder Law Specialist, certified in elder abuse and neglect. "Coffee?" Sarah asked, already pouring herself a cup from a machine in the corner. "No, thank you." Sarah settled into her chair and looked at Margaret with sharp green eyes that missed nothing. "So, tell me why you walked 2 miles to see me at 8 a.m. on a Thursday morning." Margaret's hands trembled as she opened David's lockbox. "My daughter is trying to steal my house." For the next hour, Margaret laid it all out. The slow takeover of her home. The forged power of attorney. The missing $40,000. The plan to put her in Sunny Meadows and sell the house. Sarah listened without interrupting, taking notes in a leather-bound notebook. When Margaret finished, Sarah leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Hayes," she finally said, "what your daughter is doing is called financial exploitation of an elder. It's a form of abuse, and it's a felony in this state." The word hung in the air. Abuse. "She could go to jail?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. If we pursue criminal charges, yes. The forged power of attorney alone is fraud. Add in the unauthorized withdrawals and we're looking at felony theft. Sarah leaned forward. But I need to know, is that what you want? Margaret thought of Jessica as a little girl, climbing into her lap after a nightmare. Jessica at 8, sobbing at her father's funeral. Jessica at 17, scared and excited on her first day of college. No, Margaret said. I don't want her to go to jail. I just want my life back. Sarah nodded as if this was exactly what she'd expected to hear. Then here's what we're going to do. First, we file an emergency injunction to freeze all accounts and prevent any further unauthorized transactions. Second, we get you a psychological evaluation to prove you're completely competent. That'll blow up Jessica's incompetency angle. Third, we initiate eviction proceedings. Margaret's stomach clenched. Eviction? Mrs. Hayes, they've been living in your house for 3 years without paying rent. In the eyes of the law, they're tenants. We can evict them. Sarah's voice softened. I know this is your daughter. I know this is hard. But what she's doing to you is unacceptable, and it will only get worse if you don't stop it now. Margaret closed her eyes. Eviction. The word felt violent, but so was what Jessica was doing to her. Okay, she whispered. What do I need to do? Sarah pulled out a stack of forms. Sign here, here, and here. I'll file the injunction today. We should have it by tomorrow. I'll also schedule you for a psych eval with Dr. Patricia Okonkwo. She's the best, and her reports hold up in court. Margaret's hand shook as she signed. Each signature felt like a betrayal. Each signature also felt like freedom. There's one more thing, Sarah said carefully. You should know. Your neighbor, Dorothy Reeves, is the one who called me about you. Margaret looked up sharply. Dorothy? She came to see me 2 weeks ago. She said she'd been watching what was happening to you, and she was worried. Sarah pulled out a manila folder. She's been keeping records. Inside the folder were photographs. Margaret stared at them in disbelief. Photos of Jessica's car in the driveway, time-stamped, dated. Photos of Margaret's car sitting unused, gathering leaves. Photos of Margaret through the window, always alone, always in that small room. And recordings. Dorothy had recorded Jessica through an open window, talking on the phone in the backyard. Sarah pressed play on a small recorder. Jessica's voice, tinny but clear. When she's in the home, I'll sell this place for $650,000 easy. The real estate market is insane right now. Bradley's worried about the optics, but honestly, she's lived long enough. I've waited long enough. It's my turn. Margaret felt like she'd been punched. Your neighbor has been documenting this for months, Sarah said gently. She wanted me to have evidence when you were ready to fight back. She paused. Mrs. Hayes, you're not alone in this. People see you. People care. Tears blurred Margaret's vision. I need to thank her. You will, but first let's make sure Jessica can't do any more damage. Sarah stood, extending her hand. Welcome to the fight, Mrs. Hayes. We're going to get you your house back. Margaret shook her hand, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt a flicker of hope. By the time Margaret walked back home, Sarah had offered to drive her, but Margaret had refused, needing the time to think. It was almost 11 a.m. Jessica's car was in the driveway. Margaret's stomach clenched, but she squared her shoulders and walked through her front door. Jessica was in the kitchen, on her phone, laptop open in front of her. She barely glanced up when Margaret entered. Where were you? Jessica asked, not really interested. I went for a walk. The lie came easily. Margaret wasn't ready to reveal her hand yet. You shouldn't walk alone. What if you fell? Jessica's tone was perfunctory, checking a box labeled dutiful daughter. Margaret poured herself a glass of water, her hands steady now. I'm 64, Jessica, not 90. Jessica looked up then, eyes narrowing slightly at the tone in Margaret's voice. Are you feeling okay, Mom? I'm feeling, Margaret said carefully, like I'd like to review my bank statements. Could you help me access my savings account? I seem to have forgotten the new password. Jessica's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Why do you need to access it? It's my account. I'd like to see it. Mom, we've been over this. I'm managing your finances now. You don't need to worry about it. When did I ask you to manage my finances? The kitchen went very quiet. Jessica closed her laptop slowly. You're not remembering clearly. We had a whole conversation about this. You signed the power of attorney. Did I? Margaret kept her voice level. Could I see that document? It's with my lawyer. I'd like a copy. Jessica stood up, her patience clearly thinning. What's gotten into you? I'd like to see the power of attorney I supposedly signed, Margaret repeated. And I'd like to know why there are withdrawals from my savings account that I don't remember authorizing. Jessica's face flushed. Those were for household expenses, for Connor's school fees, for repairs, for things this family needed. This family, Margaret said quietly, has been living in my house, rent-free, for 3 years. If you needed money, you should have asked. I'm your daughter. I shouldn't have to beg for what's going to be mine eventually anyway. The words hung between them like a slap. Margaret set down her water glass. Get out of my house, Jessica. Jessica laughed, actually laughed. Excuse me? You heard me. Get out. This is ridiculous. You're being ridiculous. Jessica grabbed her phone. I'm calling Dr. Morrison. You're clearly having some kind of episode. I'm not having an episode. I'm having a moment of clarity. Margaret's voice was stronger now. You've stolen from me. You've lied to me. You've forged documents. And you're trying to put me in a nursing home so you can sell my house. Jessica's face went pale, then red. You're crazy. You're actually crazy. I had a very interesting conversation with a lawyer this morning, Margaret continued. Would you like to know what she said about forging power of attorney documents? The color drained from Jessica's face completely. You went to a lawyer? I did. You can't afford a lawyer. You don't have any money. I have enough. Margaret moved toward the stairs. You have 30 days to find somewhere else to live. All of you. Jessica's shock transformed into rage. You can't evict us. We're family. Family doesn't steal. Margaret paused on the bottom step. Family doesn't lie. Family doesn't try to throw their mother away like garbage. I was trying to help you. No, Margaret said, and her voice broke just slightly. You were trying to help yourself. There's a difference. She went upstairs to her small room and closed the door, leaning against it as her legs finally gave way. She slid down to sit on the floor, her whole body shaking. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Through the door, she could hear Jessica on the phone, voice shrill. She's lost her mind. Need to do something. Can't let her ruin everything. Margaret closed her eyes and thought of David's letter. Promise me you'll never let anyone take that from you. I'm trying, David, she whispered. I'm finally trying. 3 days later, Margaret sat in Dr. Patricia Okonkwo's office, answering question after question. Who is the current president? What day is today? Can you count backward from 100 by sevens? Dr. Okonkwo was a Nigerian woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She administered the mini mental state examination, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, and a battery of other tests. After 2 hours, she set down her clipboard and smiled. Mrs. Hayes, you have the cognitive function of someone 20 years younger. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning is sound, and you show absolutely no signs of dementia, Alzheimer's, or any other form of cognitive decline. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Can you put that in writing? I'll have a full report ready by tomorrow. Dr. Okonkwo leaned forward. May I ask you something personal? Margaret nodded. Who told you that you were losing your mind? My daughter. Dr. Okonkwo's expression hardened. I see this more often than you'd think. Adult children convincing their parents they're incompetent, usually to gain control of assets. She reached across the desk and squeezed Margaret's hand. You're not losing your mind. You're finding it. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Back at the house, things had deteriorated rapidly. Jessica had stopped speaking to Margaret entirely. She and Bradley communicated through pointed silences and slammed doors. Connor and Emma were caught in the middle, confused and uncomfortable. Margaret reclaimed small pieces of her territory. She moved her armchair back into the living room from the garage. She changed the Wi-Fi password to something only she knew. She started parking her car. She'd gotten her keys back from Sarah, who'd threatened Jessica with a police report, in the garage again, forcing Jessica to park on the street. Each small victory felt enormous, but Jessica was fighting back in her own way. The morning Margaret found her prescription medications missing from the bathroom cabinet, she knew things had escalated. She found them later, thrown in the garbage outside. Jessica claimed to have been cleaning out expired medicines, but the bottles were all current. Margaret started locking her bedroom door. Then came the morning she woke to find her laptop missing. Jessica claimed she'd never seen it. Margaret found it hidden under Jessica's bed when she was looking for her stolen reading glasses. "You're paranoid," Jessica said when confronted. "You're imagining things." But Margaret wasn't imagining the way Jessica had started talking about her to visitors, always within earshot. "She's getting worse. I'm so worried. Found her wandering in the yard in her nightgown at 3 a.m. Margaret had never done this. "Doesn't remember conversations we had yesterday." Lies. All lies. Jessica was building the narrative, laying groundwork, preparing witnesses for some future battle. Margaret documented everything in her notebook. Times, dates, what was said, who was present. Sarah had told her, "In court, details matter. Write down everything." 2 weeks after her first meeting with Sarah, Margaret received a call. "The injunction is approved," Sarah said. "As of this moment, Jessica no longer has access to any of your accounts. I'm sending you new bank cards, new passwords, everything." She's completely frozen out. Margaret felt a surge of relief so intense it made her dizzy. "There's more," Sarah continued. "I filed the eviction notice yesterday. Jessica will be served papers today. She has 30 days to vacate." "She's going to be furious." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "She is. Mrs. Hayes, I want you to consider staying somewhere else for a few days, just until things calm down." "This is my house," Margaret said firmly. "I'm not leaving." "Then at least tell a neighbor what's happening. Have someone checking on you." That evening, Margaret walked 2 doors down to Dorothy Reeves's house. Dorothy answered on the second knock, her wrinkled face breaking into a smile. "Margaret, I was hoping you'd come see me." Over tea in Dorothy's cheerful kitchen, Margaret thanked her for the documentation, for the recordings, for caring when Margaret had felt invisible. Dorothy waved it away. "I've been where you are, dear. My son tried to do the same thing to me 10 years ago. I know what that kind of betrayal feels like." She squeezed Margaret's hand. "You're braver than you think, and you're not alone. Sarah, my lawyer, said you've been recording Jessica." Dorothy's eyes twinkled with mischief. "That girl talks so loud on the phone, and my hearing isn't what it used to be, so I keep my windows open. Can't help what I hear." Margaret laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in weeks. "She's going to be served with eviction papers today," Margaret said. "It's going to get ugly." "Then you come here if you need to," Dorothy said firmly. "Day or night. You bang on my door if you need a safe place. Promise me." Margaret promised. Jessica was served the eviction papers at 4:37 p.m. Margaret was in the kitchen when she heard the scream. "What the hell is this?" Jessica stormed into the kitchen, papers clutched in her fist, her face purple with rage. "You're evicting us? Your own family?" Margaret kept her voice calm, though her heart was racing. "You've been living here rent-free for 3 years. It's time for you to find your own place." "This is my house. This has always been my house. You promised it to me." "I never promised you anything." Jessica threw the papers on the floor. "I have children, Mother. Where are we supposed to go? You make over $100,000 a year. I'm sure you can find something. We can't afford rent in this area. Do you have any idea how expensive it is? Then move somewhere more affordable." Jessica's eyes were wild now. "You're throwing your grandchildren out on the street, your own grandchildren." Margaret felt the guilt try to take hold, the old familiar weight of it, but she pushed it away. "I'm not throwing anyone out on the street. I'm asking you to find your own housing, which you should have done 3 years ago." "I can't believe you," Jessica was shouting now. "After everything I've done for you, after everything I've sacrificed." "What have you sacrificed, Jessica?" Margaret's voice rose to match her daughter's. "What exactly have you given up by living in my house, eating my food, stealing my money?" "I take care of you. You steal from me." Bradley appeared in the doorway, looking stricken. "Jessica, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Bradley," Jessica rounded on him. "This is your fault. You said we should start paying her rent. You said this would happen." "I said she had a right to her own house," Bradley said quietly. Jessica turned back to Margaret, and for just a moment, Margaret saw something break in her daughter's eyes. "I hate you," Jessica whispered. The words should have hurt. A month ago, they would have destroyed Margaret. But now, standing in her own kitchen, in the house she and David had bought, Margaret felt only sadness. "I know," she said softly. "But Jessica, I need you to understand something. I love you. I will always love you, but I will not let you destroy me to feed your greed." Jessica's face crumpled, but whether it was genuine emotion or manipulation, Margaret couldn't tell anymore. "We need money," Jessica said, her voice suddenly small. "We need money for first and last month's rent, for a deposit. Mom, please, we can't afford to move without help." And there it was. Even now, even after everything, Jessica was still trying to take more. Margaret thought about her dwindling savings account, about the $8,000 left after Jessica's systematic theft. "No," she said. Jessica's face hardened. "Then you'll never see your grandchildren again." The threat hung in the air. Margaret looked at Jessica, really looked at her, and saw a stranger. When had her daughter become this person? Or had she always been this way, and Margaret had simply refused to see it? "If you're going to use Connor and Emma as weapons," Margaret said quietly, "then perhaps it's better if I don't see them. I won't let you teach them that this is how family treats each other." Jessica stared at her for a long moment. Then she grabbed her purse and stormed out, the front door slamming so hard the windows rattled. Margaret sank into a chair, her whole body shaking. Through the window, she saw Dorothy standing on her porch, clearly having heard the shouting. Dorothy gave her a thumbs up and a fierce smile. Margaret managed a weak smile in return. The next 2 weeks were psychological warfare. Jessica stopped cleaning. Dirty dishes piled up in the sink. Trash overflowed. When Margaret cleaned up, Jessica made more mess, a silent statement. "This is what you'll get without me." But Margaret had been cleaning up after Jessica for 42 years. This was nothing new. Jessica started bringing people to the house, friends, relatives, church members, staging impromptu interventions. "Your mother is unwell," Jessica would say, dabbing at dry eyes. "She's throwing her family out. She's paranoid. I'm worried about her mental state." Margaret learned to smile politely and excuse herself. Sarah had coached her. "Don't engage. Let them see a calm, rational woman. Let Jessica be the one who looks unstable." Uncle Raymond came one evening, Jessica's doing. He was 70, David's younger brother, and one of the few family members Margaret still spoke to. "Maggie," he said gently, sitting across from her in the living room while Jessica hovered nearby. "Jessica says you're going through something. Is there anything I can do?" Margaret met his eyes. "Raymond, did Jessica tell you she forged my signature on legal documents and stole $40,000 from my savings account?" Raymond's face went slack. He turned to Jessica. "Is this true?" "She's confused," Jessica said quickly. "She gave me permission to manage her finances. She's misremembering." "I'm not confused," Margaret interrupted. She pulled out a folder Sarah had prepared. "Here are the bank statements showing unauthorized withdrawals. Here's the forged power of attorney. You can compare the signature to my real signature on these other documents. Here's Dr. Okonkwo's evaluation stating I have perfect cognitive function." She handed the folder to Raymond. He read through it slowly, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he looked at Jessica with something like disgust. "You stole from your mother." No, I was helping. You forged her signature. You took her money without permission." Raymond stood. "Jessica, I love you. You're my niece, but what you've done is unconscionable." "Uncle Raymond," he held up a hand. "No, I don't want to hear it." He turned to Margaret. "Maggie, I'm so sorry. I should have been paying more attention. If you need anything at all, you call me." After he left, Jessica stood in the middle of the living room, shaking with rage. "You turned him against me." "I told him the truth," Margaret said. "That's all. Everyone is going to hate me now." Margaret felt a pang of something. Not quite sympathy, but close. "Jessica, you did this to yourself." "No," Jessica said, her voice venomous. "You did this. You ruined everything." She went upstairs and Margaret heard her on the phone again, calling more people, trying to rebuild her narrative, trying to regain control. But the tide had turned. The court hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after the eviction notice was served. Margaret dressed carefully that morning, a navy dress, simple jewelry, her hair neatly styled. Sarah had told her, "You want to look like the competent, dignified woman you are." In the courthouse hallway, she saw Jessica with her lawyer, Keith Barnett, a slick man in an expensive suit who looked like he charged by the minute. Jessica wouldn't look at her. Connor and Emma sat on a bench outside the courtroom, both on their phones, both looking miserable. Emma's eyes were red from crying. Margaret wanted to go to them, to comfort them, but Sarah had advised against it. Don't engage before the hearing. Let's keep this clean. Inside the courtroom, the judge was a woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Morrison. She had a reputation for not suffering fools. Keith Barnett went first, arguing that Jessica and her family should be allowed to stay in the house. Your Honor, my client has been providing care for her elderly mother for 3 years. She's been managing the household, handling finances, ensuring her mother's safety. To evict her now would be cruel and would endanger Mrs. Hayes, who clearly needs assistance. Judge Morrison looked skeptical. Does Mrs. Hayes have any diagnosed conditions that prevent her from living independently? Her memory is declining, Barnett said smoothly. She's shown signs of confusion, forgetfulness. Sarah stood. Objection, Your Honor. I have a comprehensive psychological evaluation from Dr. Patricia Okonkwo stating that Mrs. Hayes has excellent cognitive function with no signs of decline. She submitted the report. Judge Morrison read it, eyebrows rising. Mr. Barnett, your client seems to have confused elderly with incompetent. Mrs. Hayes is 64 years old, and according to this evaluation, in perfect mental health. Barnett shifted tactics. Regardless, Your Honor, my client has been living in this house for 3 years with her mother's permission. She's established residency. She has children in local schools. Eviction would be highly disruptive. Permission that was withdrawn, Sarah countered. Mrs. Hayes has the right to decide who lives in her house. Does she? Barnett pulled out a document. Because this power of attorney, signed by Mrs. Hayes 6 months ago, gives my client authority over property decisions. Sarah smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. Your Honor, I'd like to submit a forensic analysis of that document. She handed over a thick report. Judge Morrison read it, her expression growing stern. According to this analysis, the signature on this power of attorney differs significantly from Mrs. Hayes's verified signatures. The conclusion is that this document is likely forged. Barnett's confidence faltered. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime, Judge Morrison said coldly. She looked at Jessica. Ms. Hayes Thompson, did you forge your mother's signature on this document? Jessica's face went white. No, she must have signed it and forgotten. Forgotten? Judge Morrison's voice could have cut glass. Mrs. Hayes has a clean bill of mental health. Are you suggesting the forensic analyst is wrong? Sarah stood again. Your Honor, I also have audio recordings of Ms. Hayes Thompson discussing her plans to institutionalize her mother and sell the house without her mother's knowledge or consent. She played the recording. Dorothy's recording, Jessica's voice clear. When she's in the home, I'll sell this place for $650,000 easy. The courtroom was silent when the recording ended. Judge Morrison's face was like stone. Ms. Hayes Thompson, what you've done is called elder financial abuse. It's a felony in this state. Jessica was crying now, real tears this time. I was just trying to help. You were trying to steal your mother's house. Judge Morrison turned to Margaret. Mrs. Hayes, do you wish to press criminal charges? Margaret looked at her daughter, sobbing in her expensive suit, mascara running down her face. She thought about Jessica at 8 years old, lost and grieving after David's death. She thought about Jessica at 17, excited about college. She thought about Jessica holding Connor for the first time, tears of joy streaming down her face. And she thought about Jessica standing in the kitchen 3 weeks ago saying, I hate you. No, Your Honor, Margaret said quietly. I don't want to press charges. I just want my house back. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. Then here is my ruling. The eviction stands. Ms. Hayes Thompson, you and your family have 14 days to vacate the premises. The forged power of attorney is declared null and void. All accounts are to remain in Mrs. Hayes's sole control. She banged her gavel. Court is adjourned. Outside the courtroom, Jessica grabbed Margaret's arm. Mom, please, we don't have anywhere to go. Bradley lost his job last month. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to worry. We have nothing. Margaret looked at her daughter's desperate face and felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even sadness. Just a strange, hollow numbness. You should have thought of that before you stole from me, she said. She walked away, leaving Jessica standing in the courthouse hallway, finally understanding that her mother wasn't coming to save her this time. Sarah drove Margaret home. As they pulled into the driveway, Margaret saw Dorothy on her porch, waving. "You did it," Sarah said. "You won." Margaret nodded, but it didn't feel like winning. It felt like losing and surviving at the same time. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you get your life back," Sarah said. "You figure out who you are without being someone's doormat." Margaret looked at her house, not Jessica's, and felt the weight of 42 years pressing down on her. "I don't know who that person is anymore." Sarah squeezed her hand. "Then I guess you get to find out." The moving truck arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, exactly 14 days after the court ruling. Margaret stood at her bedroom window, the master bedroom now, where she'd moved back the day after the hearing, and watched Jessica and Bradley load boxes. Connor carried a lamp. Emma dragged a suitcase that was too heavy for her. Neither of the children had said goodbye. Margaret's hand rested on the windowsill, her fingers tracing the wood grain David had sanded smooth 38 years ago. She wanted to feel victorious. Sarah had called it a victory. Dorothy had called it justice. But watching her daughter's family pack everything they owned into a U-Haul, Margaret felt only a vast, aching emptiness. Jessica hadn't spoken to her since the courthouse. For 2 weeks, they'd moved around each other like ghosts, Jessica sleeping on the couch, avoiding eye contact, communicating only through Bradley's strained, apologetic messages. "Jessica wants to know if she can take the mixer." "Jessica is asking about the dining room chairs." Margaret had said yes to everything. "Take it all," she'd wanted to say. "Take whatever you want if it will fill the hole where my daughter used to be." But she'd learned that giving Jessica things wouldn't bring back the little girl who used to crawl into her lap during thunderstorms. That child was gone, maybe had been gone for years, and Margaret had simply refused to see it. The front door opened and closed one final time. Through the window, Margaret watched Bradley close the truck's rear door. Jessica sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, her face a mask. The truck pulled away from the curb at 10:47 a.m. Margaret stood at the window until it disappeared around the corner. Then she walked through her empty house. It had never felt more silent. For 3 days, Margaret did nothing but wander from room to room. The house felt cavernous without Jessica's family filling it. No TV blaring from Connor's room. No Emma's footsteps thundering down the stairs. No Bradley's off-key humming from the shower. Just silence. Margaret sat in her reclaimed armchair, back in its proper place by the window, and stared at nothing. She should feel liberated. She should feel free. Instead, she felt like she was floating in a vast, dark ocean with no shore in sight. On the 4th day, Dorothy knocked on her door at 8 in the morning, holding a casserole dish. "All right, enough," Dorothy announced, marching into the kitchen and depositing the dish on the counter. "You've had your wallowing time. Now it's time to live." Margaret, still in her bathrobe, blinked at her. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You've been in that same bathrobe for 3 days. Don't think I haven't noticed." Dorothy opened the refrigerator, which contained only a half-empty carton of milk and some wilted lettuce. "When did you last eat a real meal?" Margaret couldn't remember. Dorothy pulled out her phone and made a call. "Frank? It's Dorothy. I need you to come over to Margaret's house." "Yes, now. Bring groceries. Anything that looks like actual food." "Perfect." She hung up and turned to Margaret. "Frank Kowalski. He's a widower from my church. His wife died 5 years ago, and he's been doing that same lost-at-sea thing you're doing now. You two can be miserable together until you remember how to be human." "Dorothy, I don't need—" "What you need," Dorothy interrupted firmly, "is to stop sitting in this house like it's a tomb. You fought for this place. Now live in it." 20 minutes later, Frank Kowalski arrived with 4 bags of groceries and an apologetic smile. He was tall and thin, with white hair and gentle blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a cardigan that had definitely been his wife's choice, the kind of cozy, practical garment that spoke of years of companionship. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said, setting the bags on the counter. "Dorothy can be persuasive." "Persuasive," Dorothy snorted. "I'm saving both your lives. Now, Margaret, go shower. Frank, start making breakfast. I'll organize this kitchen, which looks like a Depression museum." Margaret wanted to protest, but Dorothy's no-nonsense energy was strangely comforting. She went upstairs and showered for the first time in 2 days, the hot water washing away some of the numbness. When she came back down in clean clothes, the kitchen smelled like coffee and eggs. Frank was at the stove, moving with the comfortable efficiency of someone who'd learned to cook for himself out of necessity. "Scrambled okay?" he asked. Margaret nodded, realizing she was actually hungry. They ate at the kitchen table, the three of them, an odd little assembly of damaged people trying to figure out how to keep going. "My son did something similar to what your daughter did," Frank said quietly, not meeting Margaret's eyes. "Tried to get me declared incompetent after Ellen died, said I couldn't take care of myself. Really, he just wanted to sell my house and stick me in a home so he could have the money." Margaret looked up. "What happened?" "I fought him, like you did." Frank's smile was sad. "Won the legal battle. Lost my son. He hasn't spoken to me in 3 years." "Do you regret it?" Margaret asked. Frank was quiet for a long moment. "I regret that it was necessary. But no, I don't regret standing up for myself. I spent my whole life being what everyone else needed. Ellen needed a devoted husband. My son needed a father who'd bail him out of every mistake. But nobody ever asked what I needed." He looked at Margaret then, and she saw understanding in his eyes. "You did the right thing," he said, "even if it doesn't feel like it yet." Dorothy's intervention turned into a routine. Every morning at 8, she and Frank would show up. They'd have breakfast together, then Dorothy would bully Margaret into some activity. "We're going to the library. We're walking to the park. We're going to the grocery store, and you're going to actually buy food this time." On the 6th day, Dorothy announced, "We're going to the community center. They have classes." Margaret resisted. "I'm not really a class person." "You are now." The Riverside Community Center was a low brick building that smelled like floor polish and old coffee. A bulletin board by the entrance advertised various activities: yoga for seniors, digital photography, watercolor basics, beginning violin. Margaret stopped at the last one. "Violin," she said softly. "You play?" Frank asked. "I used to, a lifetime ago." Margaret stared at the flyer. "I was pretty good, actually. I played in the university orchestra." "Why'd you stop?" Margaret thought about it. When had she stopped? After Jessica was born, probably. No time for hobbies when you're a single mother working 2 jobs. "Life got in the way," she said. "Life's getting out of the way now," Dorothy said firmly. She marched to the front desk and returned with a registration form. "Class is Thursday nights at 6. You're going." Margaret took the form, her hands trembling slightly. "I haven't played in 40 years. "Then you're 40 years overdue," Frank said with a gentle smile. Thursday night, Margaret almost didn't go. She stood in front of her closet at 5:30, trying to decide what one wore to a violin class after 4 decades. Her hands were shaking. What if she'd forgotten everything? What if she made a fool of herself? The doorbell rang. Dorothy, of course. "I knew you'd chicken out," Dorothy said, marching in. "Get your shoes. Frank's driving." "I don't have a violin. The community center has loaners. Stop making excuses." In Frank's car, Margaret's anxiety crescendoed. "What if I'm terrible?" "Then you'll be terrible with other people who are also terrible," Dorothy said. "That's the whole point of beginning violin." The class was held in a small room with folding chairs arranged in a semicircle. 6 other people were already there, ranging in age from about 50 to 80. They all looked as nervous as Margaret felt. The instructor was a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and calloused fingers. "I'm Andrea Chen. Welcome to beginning violin. Most of you are returning players, right? People who played when you were young and want to try again?" Everyone nodded. "Perfect. Here's the thing about violin. Your fingers remember more than your brain does. You'll be amazed how much comes back." She was right. When Margaret tucked the borrowed violin under her chin for the first time in 40 years, her body remembered. Her left hand found the positions. Her right arm knew how to hold the bow. She was rusty, horribly rusty, but the muscle memory was there, sleeping, waiting to be awakened. They started with simple scales. Margaret's fingers cramped almost immediately, and her tone was scratchy, but she was playing. Actually playing. When she drew her bow across the strings and produced a clear, ringing G note, something inside her cracked open. She'd forgotten this. How it felt to create something beautiful. How it felt to be Margaret the musician, not just Margaret the mother, Margaret the nurse, Margaret the doormat. By the end of the hour-long class, her fingers ached and her shoulder hurt from holding the unfamiliar position, but she felt more alive than she had in months. "Same time next week," Andrea said as they packed up. "And try to practice a little every day, even just 10 minutes. In the parking lot, Dorothy and Frank were waiting. "Well?" Dorothy demanded. Margaret realized she was crying. Not sad tears, something else entirely. "I'd forgotten," she said. "I'd forgotten I used to be someone who made music." Frank squeezed her shoulder gently. "You still are." The violin became Margaret's anchor. She rented a beginner instrument from the music store. Nothing fancy, but hers. Every morning after breakfast with Dorothy and Frank, she'd practice. 10 minutes at first, then 20, then an hour. Her neighbors probably thought she was torturing cats. The sounds she produced were often more squeak than song. But she didn't care. David's letter had said, "You are Margaret first, the woman who plays violin." She was finding that woman again, one scratchy note at a time. At her second class, a woman named Nina Patel sat down next to her. "First time back?" Nina asked. "First time in 40 years. 30 for me," Nina said. She had a slight Indian accent and warm brown eyes. "My daughter said it was silly for a woman my age to take up music again, so I'm doing it partly to spite her." Margaret laughed, and it felt good. "My daughter tried to steal my house. I'm doing this partly to spite her, too." Nina's eyes widened. "Really?" "Really. My daughter wants me to move to India and live with her in-laws," Nina said. "She says I'm too westernized, and I've embarrassed her by staying in America after my husband died. She hasn't spoken to me in 2 years." They looked at each other, two women abandoned by the daughters they'd raised. "Well," Margaret said, "their loss." Nina grinned. "Definitely their loss." After class, Nina, Margaret, Dorothy, and Frank went to a diner. Over coffee and pie, they swapped stories, not just about their terrible children, but about their lives before. Before widowhood, before disappointment, before they'd learned to make themselves small. "I wanted to open a bakery," Nina said. "My naan bread was famous in our community, but my husband said it wasn't practical, and then I was raising kids, and then he got sick." "I used to paint," Dorothy admitted. "Terrible paintings, really, but I loved it. My husband threw them all away when we moved because they were taking up too much space." "I taught music," Frank said. "High school orchestra for 30 years. I loved those kids. But after Ellen died, my son said I should retire, that I was too old to keep working. So I did. Biggest mistake of my life." They all looked at Margaret. "I wanted to travel," she said quietly. "David and I were going to see the Northern Lights. We had it all planned. We'd go when Jessica graduated college. But then he died, and I spent all the money on Jessica's education instead." "Where do you want to go?" Nina asked. "Besides Alaska?" Margaret thought about it. "Paris. I've always wanted to see Paris." "So go," Dorothy said simply. "I can't just—" "Why not?" Dorothy challenged. "What's stopping you?" Margaret opened her mouth to list all the reasons why she couldn't possibly go to Paris. But for the first time in her life, she couldn't think of any. The money Jessica had stolen was gone, but she still had her pension, her Social Security. She had enough. "I could go," she said wonderingly. "We could all go," Frank said suddenly. "What if, and hear me out, what if the 4 of us went to Paris together?" Dorothy's eyes lit up. "The Second Act Club takes Paris." "The what?" Margaret asked. "The Second Act Club. That's us." Dorothy gestured around the table. "We're all living our second acts. The first act was everyone else's story. The second act is ours." Nina raised her coffee cup. "To the Second Act Club." They all clinked cups, grinning like conspirators. Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. Possibility. Planning the Paris trip gave Margaret purpose. She researched hotels, mapped out museums, practiced basic French phrases. Every Thursday after violin class, the Second Act Club would meet at the diner and plan their adventure. "We have to see the Louvre," Nina insisted. "And the Eiffel Tower at night," Frank added. "I want to eat real French pastries," Dorothy said. "So many pastries I'll need a wheelchair to get home." Margaret started taking walks every morning, building her stamina for all the walking they'd do in Paris. She bought new clothes she actually liked, not the shapeless practical things Jessica had always said were age-appropriate. She bought a blue dress with flowers on it, impractical shoes with a slight heel, a red coat because it made her happy. She was spending her own money on herself, and it felt revolutionary. 6 weeks after Jessica moved out, Margaret walked into her basement for the first time in months. Jessica had used it as storage for things she didn't want but wouldn't throw away. Margaret started sorting through boxes, reclaiming her space. In a corner, covered with a tarp and buried under old Christmas decorations, she found it. Her easel. Margaret pulled off the tarp, dust billowing. The easel was still solid, the wood only slightly warped. Next to it was a box of her old art supplies, dried-out paints, stiff brushes, yellowed sketch pads. She carried it all upstairs to the dining room and set it up by the window, where the light was best. She couldn't paint with these old supplies, but she could draw. Margaret opened a fresh sketch pad. She'd bought it on a whim at the craft store, and sat down with a pencil. For a long moment, she just stared at the blank page. What did Margaret Hayes want to draw? Not what anyone else wanted. Not what would please Jessica or honor David's memory or be appropriate for a woman her age. What did she want? Her hand moved almost without conscious thought. She drew her kitchen window, the one she'd looked through every morning for 38 years. She drew the oak tree in the backyard, the one David had planted when they first moved in. She drew her life, the parts she wanted to remember. When Frank and Dorothy showed up for their morning breakfast the next day, they found Margaret still at the easel, surrounded by sketches. "You didn't sleep," Dorothy accused. "I couldn't stop," Margaret said, and she was smiling. "I'd forgotten how much I loved this." Frank picked up one of the sketches, the oak tree, detailed and alive. "Margaret, this is beautiful." "It's just a tree." "It's not just a tree." He held it up. "It's how you see the world, and it's lovely." The weeks passed in a rhythm of discovery. Violin on Thursdays, drawing every morning, French lessons on Tuesday nights. Dorothy had found a class, and they'd all enrolled. Planning sessions for Paris every Sunday afternoon. Margaret was busier than she'd been in years, and for the first time, every activity was something she'd chosen for herself. She started attending a watercolor class at the community center. Her paintings were clumsy at first, colors bleeding into each other in unintended ways, but Andrea from violin class was also in the painting class, and she was encouraging. "The best part about being a beginner again at our age," Andrea said, "is that we don't care about being perfect. We just want to enjoy it." Margaret painted flowers, landscapes, abstract swirls of color. She was terrible, but she didn't care. Creating something, anything, felt like exhaling after holding her breath for 40 years. She hung her favorites in the house. The gray walls Jessica had insisted on suddenly bloomed with color. Watercolor flowers, sketches of Paris landmarks she'd copied from photos, a portrait of David she'd drawn from memory. The house was becoming hers again. 3 months after Jessica moved out, Margaret's phone rang with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Grandma?" Connor's voice, uncertain and quiet. Margaret's heart stuttered. "Connor. Hi, sweetheart. I'm sorry I didn't say goodbye." The words came out in a rush. "Mom wouldn't let us. She said you were dangerous and we couldn't talk to you." "I'm not dangerous," Margaret said gently. I know that now." Connor paused. "I'm calling from my friend's phone. Mom doesn't know. She's not doing great, Grandma." Margaret closed her eyes. "Tell me." "We're living in an apartment in Riverside Valley. It's pretty small. Dad's working at Best Buy now, and Mom's between jobs. Emma cries a lot. I think she misses our old school." Connor's voice cracked. "I miss you." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "I miss you too, sweetheart." Can I come visit? Without Mom knowing?" Margaret wanted to say yes immediately. She wanted to see her grandson, to hug him, to tell him everything would be okay. But she also knew Jessica would use it against her, would accuse her of alienating her children, of being manipulative. "Connor, I want to see you so much, but I think you need to talk to your mom first. Tell her you want to visit me. She'll say no, maybe, but you have to try." Margaret's voice was firm but loving. "I'm not going to sneak around or go behind your mother's back. That's not the right way. Even if it means I can't see you? Even then, because I want you to learn that doing the right thing matters more than doing the easy thing." Connor was quiet for a long moment. "I heard what Mom did. About the money and the papers. Dad told me when they were fighting." "Connor, I'm not a kid, Grandma. I'm 15. I know what stealing is." His voice was hard in a way that made Margaret's heart ache. "I'm sorry she did that to you. I'm sorry you had to find out your mother made those choices," Margaret said softly. "I know that's hard. Are you okay? Like really okay?" Margaret looked around her house, at the paintings on the walls, at the violin in its case by the door, at the Paris guidebook on the coffee table. "You know what?" she said. "I actually am." After they hung up, Margaret sat with the phone in her hands for a long time. She'd done the right thing, telling Connor to talk to his mother first. She knew that. But God, it hurt. That night at violin class, Margaret played like she was trying to exercise something. They were working on a simple arrangement of Ode to Joy, and Margaret attacked it with an intensity that made Andrea raise her eyebrows. After class, Frank touched her elbow gently. "Want to talk about it?" They went to the diner, their usual spot, and Margaret told him about Connor's call. "You did the right thing," Frank said, echoing her own thoughts. "I know, but I hate it." "Welcome to the club." Frank stirred his coffee slowly. "My grandson is 12 now. I haven't seen him since he was 9. My son won't let me near him, says I'm a bad influence. How is that possible? Because I wouldn't give him money for his business schemes. Because I kept my house instead of selling it and giving him the proceeds. Because I chose myself." Frank's smile was bitter. "Apparently that makes me selfish." Nina, joining them with Dorothy, overheard. "My daughter tells people I abandoned the family, that I chose Western selfishness over Indian values. Really, I just refused to move in with her and be a live-in servant and nanny." Dorothy snorted. "My son tells people I'm senile and mean, because I wouldn't let him steal my late husband's coin collection to pay his gambling debts." They sat in silence for a moment, 4 people bound by similar wounds. "We're the lucky ones, you know," Dorothy said finally. "We got out. There are thousands of older people trapped in situations like we were in, too scared or too beaten down to fight back." "We should do something about that," Nina said suddenly. They all looked at her. "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "I mean, we know what it's like. We've been through it. We know how isolating it is, how shameful it feels, how hard it is to fight back." Nina's eyes were bright. "What if we started a support group for people going through elder abuse?" Frank sat up straighter. "At the community center?" "Exactly. A safe place where people can talk, get resources, realize they're not alone." Nina turned to Margaret. "You could tell your story. Show people it's possible to stand up." Margaret's first instinct was to refuse. Her story was private, painful. She didn't want to be a spokesperson for anything. But then she thought about Mrs. Langley's letter, months ago. "You remind us it's never too late to reclaim our lives." "Okay," she said. "Let's do it." The first meeting of the Elder Advocacy Support Group, Dorothy had insisted on an official name, was held 3 weeks later. Margaret hadn't known what to expect. Maybe 5 or 6 people? 23 people showed up. Most were older women, but there were a few men, too. They sat in a circle in the community center's largest room, looking at each other with the wary recognition of people who'd survived similar battles. Dorothy stood up first. "My name is Dorothy Reeves, and my son tried to steal my house." One by one, they went around the circle. "My daughter has power of attorney and won't let me access my own money. My son moved in to help, and now I can't get him to leave. My granddaughter is stealing my prescription medications. I think my nephew is forging my signature, but I'm not sure." When it was Margaret's turn, she stood on shaking legs. "My name is Margaret Hayes. My daughter forged my signature, stole $40,000, and tried to put me in a nursing home so she could sell my house." She told them the whole story. The birthday cake, the injunction, the court hearing, the eviction. "I lost my daughter," she said, her voice breaking. "But I found myself. And I don't know if that's a fair trade, but it's the one I made." When she finished, a woman in her 70s was crying. "I thought I was the only one. I thought it was my fault." "It's not your fault," Margaret said firmly, "and you're not alone." After the meeting, people surrounded her with questions, with their own stories, with desperate requests for help. Sarah Brennan, who Margaret had invited, handed out her business card to anyone who needed legal advice. Nina started a phone tree for the group, a way for members to check in on each other, to make sure everyone was safe. Frank volunteered to help people file police reports if needed. And Margaret realized something. Her pain had purpose. Her story could help others. For the first time, she didn't regret what had happened. She regretted that it had been necessary, but she didn't regret the outcome. She was free. And she was helping others find freedom too. 4 months after Jessica moved out, on a crisp October morning, Margaret stood in the airport with Dorothy, Frank, and Nina. They were going to Paris. Margaret had a new suitcase, a new passport, and a sense of adventure she hadn't felt since before David died. On the plane, she sat by the window and watched America disappear below her. She thought about Jessica, about Connor and Emma. She wondered if they were okay, if they thought about her. But she didn't let the wondering consume her. She was choosing herself, finally, unequivocally, without guilt. In Paris, they walked until their feet ached. They ate croissants for breakfast and drank wine with dinner. They saw the Eiffel Tower lit up at night and cried at the beauty of it. At the Louvre, standing in front of the Mona Lisa, Frank took Margaret's hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For being brave enough to show the rest of us it was possible." That night, back at their small hotel, Margaret wrote in her journal, "David, I finally saw Paris. I wish you were here to see it with me, but I'm learning to be here for myself too. I've been thinking about what you wrote in your letter. You told me not to lose myself in being a mother. I did lose myself for a long time. I disappeared into being what everyone else needed, but I'm finding my way back. I'm painting again, playing violin. I have friends, real friends, not people I serve, but people who see me. Jessica hasn't called. Connor did, once, but I haven't heard from him since. I don't know if I'll ever have a relationship with them again. It hurts, but I'm learning that I can hold the hurt and the joy at the same time. I can miss them and still be happy. You'd be proud of me, I think. I'm finally keeping my promise. I'm living my life. Forever yours, Margaret." They returned from Paris on a Sunday. Monday morning, Margaret woke in her own bed, the master bedroom where she belonged, and lay there for a moment, listening to the house. It was quiet, but no longer lonely. It was hers. She got up, made coffee, and sat at her easel to sketch the Eiffel Tower from memory. At 8 a.m., Dorothy and Frank showed up for breakfast, as they always did. At noon, she had violin practice. At 3 p.m., she had the Elder Advocacy Support Group meeting. They met weekly now. The group had grown to 35 regular members. At 5 p.m., she'd work in her garden. She'd planted lavender and rosemary, David's favorites. Her life was full, busy, rich with meaning. And if sometimes she looked at her phone, hoping for a message from Jessica or Connor, well, she was allowed to hope. 6 months after Jessica moved out, Margaret's doorbell rang at 11 a.m. on a Saturday. She opened it to find Connor standing on her porch, taller than she remembered, holding a wrapped package. "Hi, Grandma," he said nervously. "Happy birthday." Margaret stared at him, tears already forming. "Connor, how did you—" "I took the bus. I'm 15 now. I don't need Mom's permission." He held out the package. "I'm sorry I'm late. Your birthday was 2 weeks ago, but I had to save up for the bus fare." Margaret pulled him into a hug, this gangly boy who'd grown so much. "You came. You actually came. I wanted to see you. I've wanted to for months, but Mom—" He trailed off. "Does she know you're here?" Connor's jaw set in a way that reminded Margaret of David. "Yeah, I told her I was coming and she couldn't stop me. She tried, but I just left anyway." They went inside. Margaret made hot chocolate, Connor's favorite when he was younger, and they sat at the kitchen table. "I'm sorry about what Mom did," Connor said quietly. "About the money and everything. Dad explained it all when I asked." "You don't have to apologize for your mother's choices." "I know, but I'm still sorry." Connor looked around the house. "It looks different, brighter." Margaret followed his gaze. The paintings on the walls, the violin case by the door, the photos of Paris on the mantel. "I'm different," she said. "Brighter, hopefully." Connor smiled, then grew serious. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Do you think you'll ever forgive Mom?" Margaret took a breath. She'd asked herself this question 100 times. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Right now, I'm just trying to forgive myself." "For what? You didn't do anything wrong." "For making myself so small that I disappeared. For teaching your mother that she could walk all over me." Margaret reached across the table and took Connor's hand. "For not standing up sooner, so you could learn what boundaries look like." Connor squeezed her hand. "You're teaching me now." They talked for hours. About school, about his friends, about his dreams of studying engineering. About Emma, who missed Margaret but was too scared of Jessica's anger to say so. When it was time for Connor to leave, Margaret walked him to the bus stop. "Can I come back?" he asked. "Every other Saturday, maybe?" I would love that more than anything. Connor hugged her again. I love you, Grandma. I love you too, sweetheart. So much. She watched the bus pull away, Connor waving from the window. Then she walked back to her house, to her life, to the second act she'd claimed for herself. That evening, Margaret stood in her kitchen and did something she hadn't done in years. She baked a cake. Not red velvet. Lemon meringue, David's favorite. Her favorite too, though she'd forgotten that for a long time. As she whipped the meringue into stiff peaks, she thought about birthdays. About all the red velvet cakes she'd made, trying to make Jessica happy, trying to be the mother she thought she should be. She thought about Jessica's last birthday, when everything had fallen apart. And she thought about her own birthday 2 weeks ago, which she'd celebrated with the Second Act Club at a French restaurant, eating coq au vin and laughing until her sides hurt. The lemon cake came out perfect, golden and light, the meringue toasted just right. Margaret cut herself a slice and sat at her kitchen table, the evening sun streaming through the window. The first bite was tart and sweet and perfect. This was who she was. Not the woman who baked what everyone else wanted, the woman who baked what she loved. She thought about David's letter one more time. The world needs your light. Don't let anyone dim it. I won't, she said aloud to the empty kitchen. Not ever again. Outside, Dorothy's porch light came on. Through the window, Margaret could see her neighbor waving. Margaret waved back. She wasn't alone. She never had been. She'd just forgotten to look for the people who actually saw her. Margaret finished her cake, washed her dish, and walked to her easel. She had a painting she wanted to finish, a watercolor of the Seine at sunset from memory. As she mixed her paints, she hummed, a piece from violin class, Beethoven's Ode to Joy. It was simple, maybe even a little scratchy still, but it was hers, and for the first time in 42 years, that was enough. The community center was packed. Margaret stood at the front of the room, palms sweating slightly, looking at the 57 people who'd come to the Elder Advocacy Support Group's first anniversary celebration. Sarah Brennan stood beside her, along with representatives from the State Attorney General's office. They'd partnered with the group, using it as a model for similar programs across the state. 1 year ago, Margaret began, I was a woman who'd lost herself. I'd spent so long being what everyone else needed that I'd forgotten I was a person with needs, too. She looked out at the faces, people who'd become friends, allies, fellow survivors. Today, I want to celebrate all of you. The woman who finally got a restraining order against her son. The man who pressed charges against the caretaker who was stealing his medications. The couple who stood up to their daughter and got their house back. Applause filled the room. We're not victims, Margaret said. We're survivors, and we're thriving. After the speeches, there was cake, lemon meringue, Margaret's contribution, and coffee and conversation. Connor was there, having taken the bus as he did every other Saturday. Emma had come too this time, her first visit, nervous but hopeful. Frank presented Margaret with a gift. From the Second Act Club. Inside was a framed photograph from Paris. The four of them, Margaret, Dorothy, Frank, and Nina, standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, arms around each other, grinning like kids. We're going to Rome next year, Nina announced. It's decided. And after that, maybe Greece, Dorothy added. Margaret looked at the photograph, at these people who'd become her family. Not by blood, but by choice. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Mom, it's Jessica. I know I have no right to ask, but can we talk? I've been in therapy. I'm trying to understand what I did. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Just, can we talk? Margaret stared at the message for a long time. A year ago, this message would have sent her into a tailspin of hope and fear and desperate longing. Now she felt calm, cautious, but open. She texted back. Next Saturday at 2 p.m., coffee at the diner on Main Street. Just you, not Bradley or the kids. We'll talk. The response came quickly. Thank you. I'll be there. Margaret put her phone away and returned to the party, to her friends, to her life. She didn't know what would happen with Jessica. Maybe they'd rebuild something. Maybe they wouldn't. But either way, Margaret would be okay. Because she'd learned the most important lesson of all. She was enough, just as she was. Without sacrificing herself, without disappearing, without making herself small. She was Margaret Hayes, violinist, artist, advocate, friend, and that was more than enough. As the party wound down and people began to leave, Frank touched her elbow. You okay? Margaret looked around the room, at the laughter, the community, the evidence of lives reclaimed. You know what? She said, smiling. I really, really am. She went home that night to her house, her space, her life. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Margaret Hayes went to sleep feeling complete. Not because she had everything she wanted, but because she had herself. And that, finally, was everything.